Hello viewers and welcome back to another episode of The Model Guy. In this video we're going to be covering the M4 Sherman tank by Tamiya in 1/35 scale. I built my first model tank last summer. It was Tamiya's M5 Stuart, and I took it to the Gomes show for the competition, and I had thought I'd done a good job, but when I'd seen the other tanks that were on display there, I felt like a 5-year-old with a finger painting. I was completely out of my league, and I clearly had no idea what I was doing. So after a few months of research on YouTube and watching some other techniques, especially Night Shift, Panzermeister, and some of those other guys, I felt comfortable enough to try another tank, and here we are. I picked up this Verlinden diesel engine set at no cost from a model meeting, and decided to shove it into the Sherman so I could backdate it to an M4A2 version. So while you watch me hack the back end of this kit apart, let's talk about the Sherman and its role in World War II. The M4 Sherman tank was designed for the United States Army as an update from the M3 Lee. And when it entered service with the British Army in 1942, it actually outclassed German panzers at the time with armor, speed, and firepower. The Sherman's designers knew that the tank would be fighting on fronts far from factories and made it easy to maintain, and they standardized all the parts so it could be repaired in the field without having to come back to the factory. The transmission and engine could be swapped out of the Sherman in the field in a matter of a few hours with a trained crew. Later German tanks would suffer from this downfall as they would have to return to maintenance facilities for any type of transmission work or serious work on the engine, whereas the Americans knew that'd be easier just to replace the engine in the field rather than try to fix it. The Sherman tank was doing so well initially in combat that its designers failed to foresee any advancement in German armor and figured that the Sherman design would last the entire war. When the Sherman started running into the Tiger tank and Panther tank, the advancement in German armor put them at a huge advantage, and the only way the Germans could fight back was in numbers or air support. With a 75mm gun, the Sherman had no chance penetrating a Tiger or Panther front on in a tank fight. Sherman designers now had a serious problem on their hands trying to give their crews a fighting chance against the advanced German armor. The British solution was to upgrade the Sherman to what they called the Firefly with a 17-pounder gun, which actually would penetrate Tigers and Panthers. But they only had so many Fireflies to go around, so often one Firefly would accompany 3 to 4 Shermans with 75mm guns, and they would try to split the German fire while the Firefly tried to take out the German tank. The Americans, in turn, upgunned the Sherman with a 76mm gun. And although this offered an improvement in fighting against the Tigers, the 76mm still had a problem penetrating Panther tanks. Luckily for the Americans and the British, a lot of the Panther tanks were suffering transmission problems and were being pulled from service or were being destroyed by their crews after breakdowns. At the end of World War II, for every Tiger or Panther tank the German army lost, the Americans on average had lost 5 Shermans. Over 49,000 Sherman tanks were produced in American factories during World War II. One Tiger tank commander summed it up when he said that they ran out of shells before the Americans ran out of tanks. The last variant of the Sherman, the EZ-8, would go on to serve in Korea and continue in American Army service until 1957. This kit that I'm building today is actually using a diesel engine, which was rare for Sherman tanks as most of them were gas-powered engines. What's the difference between a diesel engine and a gas engine in a tank, you might ask? Diesel has a much higher ignition temperature than gasoline, so therefore, if your gasoline-powered tank gets hit by a shell, it's less likely to catch fire than a gas-powered tank. However, the disadvantage of a diesel engine is it's much more expensive to design and build, so therefore it's cheaper to keep putting gas-powered tanks in the field, especially when you're building 49,000 of them. Because Sherman tanks caught fire so easily, the Germans would refer to them as Tommy cookers. After the war, many British crews would refer to the Sherman as the Ronson in reference to the Ronson lighter because they would light on the first strike every time. I only found 2 photos of a diesel Sherman's engine bay, so I had to use a little bit of artistic freedom here to create this. So in short, if you're looking for a historically accurate Sherman, this probably isn't going to be it. Since I'm building this as a British Sherman Mk III, aka M4A2, I decided to make it in a desert livery from North Africa circa 1942, and being Africa in the desert, I decided to add some dust and sand into the engine bay. If you're wondering how to make your own acrylic dust, head on over to Night Shift's channel and he will help you out with that. You won't find paper air cleaners on this engine, as this is actually using oil baths to take dirt and dust out of the air before going into the engine. Even as a heavy diesel technician, I've only seen this once on an engine, and that was on an air-cooled German diesel engine on a stacker from the late 90s. The nice thing about this homemade acrylic dust is it's very thin, so you can apply thin coats and slowly build it up over time until you're happy with the effect. One of the last steps before closing up the engine bay is adding some fuel stains here on the floor. If you've ever changed the fuel filters on a heavy diesel engine, you know how likely it is you're going to spill fuel everywhere, so I think this is kind of accurate. And now with the engine in place, you can't see any of it. By using copper wire instead of resin pipes, it made it easier to align the cooling fans and get them into the reservoirs without breaking or damaging anything. The engine was missing the exhaust pipe, so again copper wire came to the rescue. The M4A2 conversion kit is very close to being a drop fit, but there are a few areas where you're going to have to add some styrene or putty to close the gaps. I should mention that earlier in the video there was a lot of test fitting of the upper and lower hulls with the resin piece in place unpainted just to make sure everything fit properly. All of that test fitting paid off though, because when it was time to actually glue the hull pieces together there was zero issues with the fit. Now we get to the part of the video where my inexperience as an armor builder is going to show. I decided to cut out the welds on the kit and replace them with my own from Tamiya epoxy putty. I started with the rear of the tank because these are the easiest welds to access. I'm using very light pressure and multiple passes, this way if the knife does slip, I'm not going to sever my finger. So remember kids, don't try this at home. Try it at your friend's house. As you can tell, this is a very slow process, but it's not something you want to rush. Or you could end up slipping and damaging the hull. With all the welds removed, it's now time to glue the last resin piece in place and to get ready to do the metal cast texture. Or you get to put all that on hold when you realize that your rear plate is actually 2 full millimeters narrower than the actual tank itself. So once again, it's styrene to the rescue. Tamiya has already done some nice texture on the metal with this kit, but I wanted to enhance it. So by taking a few pages, or in this case a couple chapters out of the Night Shift playbook, I'm going to mix some Tamiya extra thin cement with some Tamiya gray putty and mix it together. Once everything is almost fully blended, I'm going to take an old paintbrush and start applying this in a thin layer to the hull. This isn't a Russian tank, so I didn't want to get too crazy with this effect. The Tamiya extra thin glue serves two purposes. Not only does it thin the putty, it also will help eat into that plastic a little bit and really get this to sit in place. If you put this on too thick, you can always come back with a heavier grit sanding sponge and knock it down. You just make sure you're taking care to not put the cast texture anywhere it shouldn't be, i.e. on the light guards. Now that the putty's had time to dry, I'm going to knock back that texture quite a bit with a sanding sponge. Remember, I'm looking for a rolled metal steel effect here, not a cast texture, i.e. like the turret. Now with the metal texture finished, it's time to put the welds in place, because it wouldn't make sense to put the texture over the welds, would it? For this, I simply mix 2-part epoxy putty together from Tamiya and roll it out into a noodle shape. Right now this is a bit of a Shanghai noodle shape. I'm looking more for a chow mein noodle shape, if that makes sense. By adding the water to the styrene sheets, it's keeping the epoxy from sticking. The nice thing about the Tamiya epoxy putty is you only need a little bit to go a long ways. So as I roll this out thinner and thinner, I just cut a section off and work the next section until I get the diameter I want. By using the Tamiya putty, you also have a long working time as well to set things up. And if you're not happy, you can actually pull the whole weld out. And you have about an hour to work with this stuff before it starts to harden. In my last tank video, I used stretch sprue. And the difficulty there is once it starts to harden, you can't do anything else with it. The stretch sprue doesn't have that same moldability that the putty does. While you're watching me play with my noodle, why don't you comment below with a new modeling technique that you learned that was a game changer? And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. Here's where my inexperience with the weld beads is really going to show. Even just trying to get this noodle into place was trouble, but I found it's because it was still a little bit wet and you have to actually push it into the groove a little more aggressively than I originally thought to get it to stay in place. I am making this look so much harder than it actually is. I won't lie either, I was also watching Tiger King at the same time, so I was pretty distracted. The best way to do this is to keep everything wet except for the place you're trying to stick the weld. Notice how as it starts to line up, it's now stuck to my thumb and I pull it out of place. Once I figure that out, it starts to stick in place and I'm able to smooth it down. The next step is to take my modified Pepsi can toothpick here that's wet and to start punching those weld beads in place. On hindsight, these are some very thick welds, and if I had taken my time a little bit more, they would be a lot cleaner than they are. The further along I got with the tank, though, the better the weld started to look. By the time I'd finished welding all the seams on the hull, I was starting to feel a lot more confident and started welding some other bits in place as well. This included light guards, tool mounts, and then I started doing the hatch on the side of the turret. I felt that these were the best beads that I'd done to date, and I left everything to dry overnight to harden. But then I looked at some photos the next day and realized that I had screwed up royally, and that this hatch was actually cast on the turret and it was not welded in place. It turns out this wasn't that big of a deal because all I had to do was come in with a file and scrape that putty out of the way and then add in some more texture to cover up the repair. So all in all, I only set myself back about half an hour. I cut what was supposed to be hatch handles off the kit and made my own out of soldering wire. Once everything is dried on the kit, I wipe it down with some rubbing alcohol and get it ready for paint. The rubbing alcohol just makes sure that any oils from my hands or dust or dirt's wiped off the kit. For Mr. Surfacer, I usually thin that down with 60 to 70% Mr. Leveling Thinner just to get a nice smooth surface. I planned on painting this kit with some lacquer paints, so to protect the Mr. Surfacer and keep it from being reactivated, I sealed that in place with some Stylin' Res. This is a very easy primer to use. You can shoot it right out of the airbrush at 30 psi and straight on the plastic. There's no thinning required and it dries very hard. I found myself at a bit of a crossroads when it came to colors for this paint. I knew I wanted to do a British Mark III Sherman in desert colors, so I initially used a British green on the tank. But I found that that was too bright and it was nowhere near the colors that were showing up for liveries. I decided just to fire some Tamiya olive drab instead and lay some light middle stone on top. I imagine right now there's some British armor experts getting ready to set fire to the comment section on this video, but please hold your fire until you see the end of the video. The weathering will completely change the colors of these paints in the end. I did not have a light middle stone color in the stash, so I decided to mix some desert yellow with some buff to get as close as I could. I'm also making sure that I only paint the road wheels and drive gears from one side because these would not have been removed for a full paint job. One thing I did not expect to be as difficult as it was painting the camouflage on this tank. Because it's a hard edge camouflage, it's something I've not actually done before. All of my aircraft paints have pretty much been soft edged or masked off on a nice straight fuselage. But a tank has all these weird curves and bends you have to get over. And because I cut the masks out with a hobby knife, it was kind of straight and it didn't have that nice smooth curve I wanted. So after I removed the masks and everything had time to dry, I thinned down some Tamiya olive drab and used a brush to clean up those edges. I was a little concerned with that line that's left after brush painting, but once I applied the flat clear coat, it deleted that altogether. Once I was happy with the camouflage, I came in with some buff that was highly thin and just added some dust to the bottom side of the tank. Once all the acrylic paints had dried, I sealed it all with an all-clad semi-gloss clear. But this was a mistake because when it came to the oil paints, the enamel thinner somehow reacted with the all-clad and it started to lift decals and ruined the first oil layer I had painted. It caused it to leave this weird dotted film instead of a nice filter. So next time I'll just stick with what I know and use some Tamiya flat clear. Here I am again, chancing my luck as I drill out the gun sight and the barrel on the 50 cal and the 30 cal machine guns. By doing this, you're adding a little bit of detail to the gun that draws your eye and makes it a little more realistic. One thing I liked about my Typhoon build was how the guns looked with the Mr. Metal Color iron paint. This looked a lot better than the flat black guns with steel pigment I'd used before. I painted the ammo canister with an olive drab paint just to add a little bit of contrast to the tank and to the khaki gun mount that was painted to match the tank. Weathering was a bit of a disaster starting out with this tank. I tried to make my own filter using some yellows and raw umber to a very high ratio of enamel thinner, but this filter reacted with the all-clad clear, as you can see here, and it started sticking and pulling away the clear coat. I didn't realize how bad this was until I was on my second layer of oils and noticed that the side decals on the tank had started to lift. After the first layer of oils had dried, I added some brown, yellow, and white oil dots to the tank to add a filter and break up the light Middlestone paint and try to get a little more depth and wear. After painting the kit's vinyl tracks German gray, I came in with some olive drab to paint the links. I don't know if these would have been painted the light Middlestone that the rest of the tank was painted in, but I decided it would add a little bit of contrast and interest. Once that was done, I painted the actual treads on the tracks in a steel color. One thing I noticed about the heavy equipment at work is the part of the track that's in constant contact with the ground usually stays shiny, as well as any parts that hit a roller or anything like that. I did feel that this might have been too shiny for this tank where it was going weather-wise, so I decided to add a light rust wash to tone down that steel color. By leaving these rollers freewheeling, it makes it easier to paint the rubber section. While I was painting these wheels, I then realized that the oil paints on the hull had decided to do their own weird thing after they had dried and had a weird texture on them. I'm still not 100% sold if it was the all-clad clear or the AK odorless thinner working with the oil paints I had off Amazon. But with how everything was turning out, I was not happy with the tank and I was almost getting ready to put it on the shelf of doom. As I'm putting these tracks on, you can see there's like a splotchiness on the sides of the hull. One nice thing though about spitting road wheels and drive sprockets is you can pull that track into place. I was hoping that my first panel liner pass would kind of take that blotchiness away, but in the end it still stood out. I figured the easiest way to fix this would be to come back in with my airbrush with a very diluted color and try to tone that down. And by toning down that splotchiness, it was also going to tone down the olive drab and the Middlestone color. While I'm trying to figure out what to do with the wash, I'm just blending in that panel liner with some thinner. And here comes the airbrush again. The nice thing about having a very thin paint is it gives you time to build up the layers. It gives you a lot more control. Notice how I'm testing this out on the back of the tank before I do it anywhere else. Fortunately, it worked, so I decided to move it to the front of the tank and the other areas that were affected. With this last airbrush layer, it also lets me tie in the wheels and the tracks to match the tank. Once everything had dried, I decided to add some chips to the tank, just using some sponge and Vallejo paints. I kept this mostly around the hatches and any areas that would have seen a lot of crew movement. And heavier chips were added with a graphite pencil to show the steel underneath the paint. I found this was a huge improvement over the Mr. Color Silver I used on my Stuart tank build. Remember those engine bay doors I cut earlier with the razor saw? Well, here they are again. By not hacking them out with my Dremel, I was able to reuse them. All the viewports and lenses on this tank are made from the green spruce, so I had to use some clear colors to try to make that lens effect stand out. On hindsight, I should have painted this before putting the guard in place, but I was able to touch it up just using some khaki color. The viewports received the same treatment afterwards just to clean them up. Then I'm going to add some fuel stains around the fuel ports on the tank. If filling these is anything like trying to fill a hydraulic tank on the back of a truck, you're going to make a little bit of a mess every time you do it. I tie in the tools with the tank by adding some AIRFIELD dust. And that nice and clean commander's hatch is dirtied up as well as the top of the 50. I'm probably triggering a lot of sergeant majors and warrant officers with this. Because I use Vallejo airfield dust, I get that to seal in place with some Vallejo thinner. And then the last piece I'm going to work on here before the tank is complete is the exhaust. So following Uncle Nightshift's advice again, I start with some sky gray, add some chips, some different rust tones, and then seal it all in together with some rust wash. Once I tie everything together with a wash and it's dried, I glue it to the back of the tank, and that's going to bring this build to a close. I'm definitely happy with how this tank turned out considering the missteps I had along the way. It's a huge improvement I feel compared to my Stuart, and I'm definitely looking forward to doing another tank down the road. As always, leave your comments and criticism in the comment section, throw me a like, and if you don't like the video, let me know why, because that'll help me improve and bring you better content. I am the Model Guy, and I'll see you next time.